Well, I'm delighted to be here, especially to share the panel with friends from many, many, many decades long, and some newer friends as well. Tim and I, some people don't realize this, Tim and I were graduate students together. Jeremy was just finishing his PhD when I began as an assistant professor at Berkeley. Some of us have known each other longer than some of you have been alive. Trust me, we think about this. The 18th century Scottish poet Robert Blair has some lines on friendship with which I would like to begin, and they are these. Friendship, mysterious cement of the soul, sweetener of life, and solder of society. Jack has a gift for friendship that has impacted the life of every friend he has had. It is not just a sweetener of life, though it surely is that too. What I really like about this quote is the reference to solder of society. Because if any one person has served as someone who attaches, affixes, links, bridges, or joins us together as French historians, it has been Jack. He must have had moments of jealousy or resentment, because we all do, but he has had a remarkable ability to bracket such sentiments in favor of making connections and keeping connections strong. He is truly a solder of society. I am not saying that Jack is just a people person. Others here, as you have already heard, will do justice to his research and very diverse published work. He is well known as a pioneer of the studies of the press and as a general commentator on the state of French revolutionary and revolutionary studies more generally. But those who know him know that he has also been a constantly supportive and encouraging presence in the field in ways that far transcend the impact of any particular printed work. I know that I am hardly alone in benefiting from that generosity of spirit, but I have benefited from it almost as long as anyone else has, so I have seen it in its various incarnations. We met as young assistant professors in the same field. I think it was in 1976 at the San Francisco meeting of French Historical Studies, but he will correct me if I am wrong. And from that first moment, Jack was an amazingly supportive friend. He wasn't a tenured professor, he wasn't a chair, he wasn't a dean. We were in exactly the same boat. Without in any way denigrating his own contributions, he always found the good in what others were doing. When opportunities came his way, as he became more prominent, he always looked for openings in which he could involve others. Thus, in the 1980s, he asked me to join him in working on what was originally a CD-ROM, and then in 1998 launched as the website Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, Exploring the French Revolution. He didn't need me to do this. He was working with an extraordinary team at the American Social History Project of the City University of New York, and with Roy Rosenzweig and others at his own institution, George Mason University. Stephen Breyer and Josh Brown of the American Social History Project and Roy Rosenzweig of GMU were visionaries. Trust me, the word doesn't begin to capture their creative and far-sighted qualities. It was a gift to be involved with such people. I came on board as something of an outsider, helping to build content, but Jack took on almost all the heavy lifting of grant writing, and once we had funds, shockingly large amount of funds for the time, he had to do the work of organizing postdoctoral fellows and graduate assistants. I got to participate in all the fun things, like recording audio in New York studios with Penny Bender, and going with Jack and an assistant and one of those big original scanners to Visil, where we were allowed to scan virtually anything we wanted at the Musée de la Révolution Française. The Musée had only recently been set up under the benevolent directorship of Philippe Borde as part of the preparation for the bicentennial. And in those days, and they have changed, fortunately, trying to get images out of the Bibliothèque Nationale would have been nightmarish. We had a blast in Vizille, not to mention eating lunch at the Train Bleu in the Gare de Lyon before getting on the train. Jack's skill at organizing that huge and unwieldy project through to its happy completion at a time when such websites were only beginning to appear. Jack's skill saw it through to completion. And this was really, it's hard to appreciate now because we thought we were doing a CD-ROM because there were no websites of this sort. And it was really Roy who understood very early on that the CD-ROM, which we did do, was going to have to become a website. More recently, as you know, I ended up writing a new textbook on the French Revolution and Napoleon with Jack, because when he was approached to do one, he insisted that the publisher ask me to join in. I would never have undertaken the task on my own, and once again Jack's organizational skills kept the process moving along at a brisk pace. It's up to the readers to decide how happy was the outcome. About the Liberty, Equality, Fraternity website, there can be no question, not because it is not now somewhat outdated, though there's a new version of it that has just appeared, but because it has proved useful over more than 20 years to thousands of students and teachers. If you are asking yourself, why does being a solder of society matter? Just look around. French historians stand out among Europeanists not because they are smarter or better at languages, though why anyone would take on French is another question, but because they have a better time. We have a better time. We have a better time in the archives and a better time at professional meetings because of the sociability, and not just because Paris is a superior city. True, it helps that we work on the country known for its wines and cheeses, and the wine certainly doesn't hurt when it comes to sociability. Jack has exemplified the kind of social cement any professional society needs in order to thrive. I know that others will take up that mantle in the future, but I also know that one reason they will is that at some moment in the past, Jack helped them out in one way or another. He set an example that will resonate for many years to come. Thank you.
I know Jack will forgive me for the following indiscretion, but I'm not sure about the rest of you. Normally, someone in my position would begin by talking about Jack's work. But I actually want to start by mentioning an article by a different historian. In fact, an article by Lynn Hunt. Of course, considering the widely successful collaboration between Jack and Lynn that you just heard about, that led to 2 textbooks and a popular website, you must admit that there is a certain logic with beginning remarks about Jack with something from Lynn. In 1994, Lynn wrote a short piece published in 18th Century Studies on interdisciplinarity, wryly entitled The Virtues of Disciplinarity. I doubt that even Lynn considers this a major opus in her accomplished work, but it has made a large and lasting impression on me. In that piece, Lynn argued that the best way for historians to approach the wave of interdisciplinarity then and now sweeping academia was not to erase the borders of disciplines, but rather, she argued, by shoring them up and recognizing exactly where such borders lay. Lynn criticized historians who tried to practice literary criticism in art history and vice versa. She called for scholars to be true to their disciplinary craft as they borrowed other methodologies and approaches and sources from other fields. It is not that Lynn hoped to roll back interdisciplinarity. She just insisted that we begin by acknowledging our own professional preferences and not attempt to clone one another into some homogeneous form. In her words, you cannot cross boundaries if you don't know where they are. She argued then against the grain. In the large kingdom, sometimes called the history of ideas, particularly the history of political ideas, Jack Censer is a model of the type of interdisciplinarity espoused then by Lynn. To our regret as a profession, I think, many of the intellectual historians we most admire aspire not only to be read by political theorists, but to be considered themselves political thinkers or political philosophers. Jonathan Israel is in fact only the latest in a long line of successful and accomplished intellectual historians who use the history of ideas in the service of making a contribution directly to liberal political thought. What makes Jack's three books that I'm going to discuss, Prelude to Power, The French Press in the Age of Enlightenment, and more recently, Debating Modern Revolution, the Evolution of Revolutionary Ideas, what makes these stand out to me is precisely that they approach the history of political ideas squarely from the vantage point of history, not from political theory, literature, or philosophy. Take Prelude to Power. We may forget today that when Jack sat down to write his PhD dissertation on the dissemination of radical ideas during the early years of the French Revolution, the most influential book on the topic was still arguably Jacob Tallmann's Origin of Totalitarian Democracy, first published in 1952, which, whatever you might think about its Cold War ethos, approached its subject squarely as a student of political theory, in which the influence of Rousseau's ideas was somehow magically transferred from Enlightenment thinker to revolutionary activists such as Sieyès and Robespierre. Jack had a very different and novel approach. He would treat such ideas as they appeared embedded in the press, and he approached the press itself as an autonomous institution that was affected by the revolution and which had a significant impact upon the revolution. In Prelude to Power, we see how no one's ideas, be they Rousseau or anyone else, simply drifts through the streets of Paris. Rather, we see how the press mediated and mutated such ideas as a means of describing and reflecting upon the unprecedented events that were taking place across the capital and country. Considering the rush to get things into the daily press, the velocity of news production in revolutionary France, Jack showed us how the ideas could only approximate what they meant to describe. This was a very different history than Tallmann's, and one that had an immediate impact, at least upon one younger scholar who shortly wrote a copycat book on another set of radical publishers in Paris, the Cercle Social. Jack continued honing that approach to the history of political ideas in The French Press in the Age of Enlightenment, which appeared in 1994. There he showed, among other things, that the number of political periodicals in France expanded almost fourfold between 1745 and 1785. In his conclusion, Jack noted that his study fit comfortably within Jürgen Habermas's now famous argument regarding the growth of the public sphere in the 18th century. Jack noted, however, that Habermas had focused primarily on the literary press and the popularity of the new modern novel. Jack writes, "But the existence of a political press was completely unanticipated by Habermas." In Jack's, end of quote. In Jack's hands, again, what is important about the Enlightenment is not the political ideas in their pure form, but rather how such ideas were mediated in a European-wide institution, the French language political press. In his most recent book on the evolution of revolutionary ideas, once again, any history of ideas, not so much addressed within a philosophical tradition, but squarely embedded within events and institutions. Here Jack is interested not so much in the transcendence of revolutionary ideas, but the interplay between state power, violence, and ideology. While many other historians of revolutionary ideas focus on figures such as the syndicalist anarchist George Sorel because of the sheer novelty of the thinker's ideas, Jack is less interested in that aspect. Rather, he is drawn to figures such as the 19th century godfather of Italian unification, Mazzini, whose thought was not applied independently, but, and I'm quoting Jack here, required violence to establish nationalism and make a revolution. Jack inspires intellectual historians to avoid studying political ideas for their own sake, and instead focus on institutions such as the periodical press to discover how such ideas reached and affected the public. At a moment when book historians such as Richard Shear, Mark Towney, Simon Burroughs, and Mark Curran are expanding the horizons of book history, but also threatening to make book history a kind of marginal technical field, we need more historians to use Jack's work as a model that joins the technicalities of the publishing marketplace with a more traditional history of ideas. Now, this brief analysis of Jack's work has wrongly ignored the very important contributions he has made to his journal review essays, and I'm so glad Tim focused on that. And let me just riff off of one thing Tim said that's a bit of a memory. When I was a young assistant professor writing my first book reviews, Jack gave me the best advice for approaching a book review. He told me, if you're going to criticize a book in a book review, please don't criticize the author for not writing the book you would have written. Criticize the author for what the author sets out to do, his vision or her vision for that project, and don't put yourself in that review. That's an easy thing to say, but because I don't know about you, I don't read books that way. I actually, when I'm reading and when I'm trying to read aggressively, I am rewriting the book as I would write it. And I'm continually in that dialogue. And so to back off from that stance and to accept Jack's advice is something I know I've had in every book review that I've written. I think we can agree that Jack is among us able to see long-lasting trends and landmarks in historical scholarship with gifted insight, and that's what his review essays have contributed best of all. But Jack is not someone that usually reflects formally on his own method as a historian, and that's why it's been such a delight to be part of this symposium and make this contribution to it. Thank you.
The first time I heard the name of Jack Censer mentioned was one of the worst moments in my career as a historian of the French Revolution. It was the summer of 1973, and I was in Paris for the very first time doing pre-dissertation research on the vague project I had in mind about the press during the French Revolution. And of course, I met other American graduate students at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and one of them was a student, or had been a student colleague of Jack's. And when I explained what I was working on, Mark Alexander said to me, "Oh, that's too bad. A student at Hopkins just did that topic." So my first summer of research in Paris was totally ruined, and I had to immediately write a letter. Some of you are old enough to remember this now archaic form of communication to this Mr. Censer, and find out whether, in fact, I needed to find a totally different topic. And that was the start of a beautiful friendship. Jack and I actually can't quite agree on the details of when we first met in person, but when I did meet him, I discovered an extraordinarily generous colleague who was several years ahead of me, of course, in his career. I've often thought if Jack had been thinking of his own interests, he might very well have discouraged me from going further on the subject of the press. There is a competitive element in academia. Some years later, I was also interviewed for the job at George Mason, and we know what a good decision they made in that case. But instead, Jack was extremely supportive. He pointed out to me that actually the direction I wanted to go in my work was quite different from what he had done in Prelude to Power, or in the dissertation that became Prelude to Power. He was extremely helpful in pointing me toward important questions that I would have to answer in my own work. And he has remained a friend and counselor and supporter throughout my entire career, most recently in being willing to take his own time to read the manuscript of my forthcoming more than 600-page new history of the French Revolution, and give me many valuable comments on it. So fortunately, I didn't let this first introduction to Jack Censer discourage me, and as I say, the result has been a wonderful friendship. We did a number of collaborative projects together, including a book. Do you remember the title of the University of California volume, Jack? Press and Politics in the Old Regime, in which, among other things, my function was mostly to sort of read over the other contributors' contributions and give them a detailed critique. And Jack's, as I always recall, was to threaten to take their children hostage and hold them until they got the final corrected versions in, so we could send it to the publisher. My three co-panelists have said such insightful things about Jack's work that I'm left without too much to add, but I think there is one point I would like to stress about Jack as a historian, and that is that he has always been willing to take on the big questions head on. He has in his early research, particularly Prelude to Power, and another of his favorite publications, in my mind, an article he did on the illustrations in the radical press, the engravings that accompanied them in the early years of the Revolution. He was a pioneer in using the quantitative methods that were then characterized as the new social history, but applying them, as our previous speakers have said, to the history of ideas in some very original ways. We often credit Robert Darnton with the invention of this notion of the social history of ideas, but Jack has a solid claim to be considered as one of its earliest proponents in our field of French Revolutionary studies. The project he did on the book on the French press in the Age of Enlightenment took on a staggering challenge. The volume of the periodical literature in French in the 18th century is immense. Jack and I collaborated happily for many years with an equipe of very devoted French scholars led by Jean Segard and the late Pierre Rétat, who unfortunately died last summer. It took dozens of French scholars to produce some very comprehensive reference works on the French publications and the French journalists of the 18th century. Jack, undaunted, courageously decided to take on the entire subject all by himself and produced a survey of the French periodical press in the Enlightenment that has not been equaled since. Nobody else has been willing to take on this challenge or a project of those dimensions. He has a very broad way of addressing the issue of the role of the media in society and historical perspective. He didn't hesitate to take his the framework that he had worked out for studying the press in old regime and revolutionary France and apply it in a completely different context in the book that Tim Tackett mentioned about On the Trail of the DC Sniper, and show how work in our field could produce valuable insights for understanding the media in our world today. And of course, he has taken on the small issue of comparative study of revolutions and produced a very useful volume for pedagogical purposes on that subject. Another thing that you have heard, I think, through the comments of Tim and Lynn and Gary, is that Jack has always had a very good sense of the contributions he could make that would not only further research in his fields, but further teaching and help draw new generations of scholars and students into the subjects that interest him. Lynn has told us something about the collaboration that resulted in the CD-ROM and website on the French Revolution, and that is, of course, a brilliant example of Jack's vision and seeing how these new technologies would enable us to bring the French Revolution into our classes, interest our students in it in radically new ways, and I'm sure many of us in this room have profited from that and made use of it in our courses. Nobody has yet mentioned the series of edited volumes that he edited with Dorsey Press, which I guess has changed its name and is now Routledge, which brought together readings on a wide variety of subjects, and Jack, of course, guided the people who edited those volumes, and those too, including his volume on the French Revolution and intellectual history, have been important contributions to pedagogy. But when I think about Jack's greatest contribution to history, it is along the lines of what Lynn Hunt already stressed, and that is his extraordinary ability for connecting people together, encouraging young scholars and older scholars. I remember his extraordinary personal generosity to G.H. Taylor at one of the meetings of the French Historical Society when Taylor clearly was very much at the end of his career, and I imagine close to the end of his life, but Jack wanted to help his former teacher make one more public presentation. I know from my personal experience how much Jack cares for everybody he meets, not just as a professional colleague, but as a human being and the interest that he takes in every aspect of people's lives. He didn't actually introduce me to the woman who has been my wife for the last 40 years, but it was him who said, when I was debating with myself, was it really worth calling this woman at the phone number she had given me, given that we had at most a day and a half to pursue this relationship? It was Jack who said, "Oh, go ahead, do it. You never know what's going to happen." I don't know if she has ever forgiven you, but but I did it. I think Jack's approach to people, as so many of you in the room I'm sure will agree, is related to his enthusiasm for history. He understands that historical scholarship and teaching is done by human beings, and that it is important to promote human connections among scholars, and that is what keeps the field and our subject alive. It is not just great intellectual discoveries in the archives in the abstract, but it is our conversations with each other about what they mean, how they could be translated into publications and presentations in other media, how you could use them to draw new generations of students into the subject. And Jack is the exemplar of how to do that. He claims to be retired now, but I think we're all happy to know that he's still busy with many projects, and I trust we will be enjoying his company and his inspiration for many years to come. And I want to thank you, Jack, for more than 40 years of friendship.